The US has stepped up its support to Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announcing $1 billion in new funding during a fourth visit to the capital, Kyiv. It includes $665 million in new military and civilian security assistance. And it coincides with the latest Russian missile strike on a market in the Donetsk region that's killed at least 17 people. Joining me for more on this, Dr Matthew Sussex with the ANU Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Thanks for your time. So $1 billion, quite an interesting aspect of this so-called tank-piercing shells, and they're made in part from degraded uranium. Talk us through that type of weapon and why it is causing some controversy.
Yeah, that's right. These are depleted uranium tank shells that the United States has been using for a very long time. In fact, used them in the first Gulf War and used them again in Iraq. It's decided to supply them to the Ukrainians on the grounds that they're very, very good at piercing armour. So this is not uranium that can be used to produce a nuclear reaction. It is, however, very, very dense. And because it's so dense, it makes it really good at basically going through armour. The Ukrainians have been asking for it for some time. There's controversy around it because, of course, it is, a radioactive element and emits very low levels of radiation. Now, I think it's the World Health Organization says that it shouldn't be too much of a problem, but they do note some concerns about, what happens if this potentially gets into groundwater. The issue with this, of course, as well is, the Russians have very much condemned it. But then their armed forces use depleted uranium and have been doing so for years and years and years as well. So I suppose both of them are to blame when it comes to this.
Yeah, well, given that, you're not going to listen to Russian lectures, might I say. What about the offensive overall? Last time we spoke, it was in a bit of a stalled moment. There's been an increased push. How would you say it's progressing from the Ukrainian point of view at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the latest assessment that's come out of the Pentagon is that while initially they thought the Ukrainians weren't going to achieve their counteroffensive objective by the time that winter really set in, now they think it's quite possible. And the reason for that is that the Ukrainian armed forces have breached the main line, I guess, of Russian defences, the so-called Surovikin lines of anti-tank munitions and mines, anti-personnel mines, trenches, and so on. They're about 10 to 15 kilometres from a very important strategic town known as Tokmak. And if they reach that town, then not only do they cut a really important road and rail link that the Russians use to resupply their forces in the south, but they can also bring the coast, which the Russians control, under artillery fire. And that would make the Russian position, pretty difficult to sustain over a long period of time.
Okay, well, that is an interesting one to keep an eye on. The other one I noted was that Ukraine has a new defence minister, so the previous one under some corruption allegations. And I guess it's a reminder that Volodymyr Zelensky is still just a political leader trying to hold together a government in very difficult conditions. If his leadership in any way or government falters or fails, that could be disastrous. And for all the talk of Putin and his troubles, he's got a pretty strong grip on things too. Zelensky has that weight on his shoulders.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. Oleksii Reznikov, the defence minister, most people think he did extremely well in the job. But the problem with that is that Ukrainian politics prior to the war commencing and the Ukrainian economy had significant problems with corruption. Reznikov was really unable to deal with that. And so he was kind of tainted by it, particularly over things like the delivery of rations to soldiers, the delivery of arms and ammunition and so on. And this has really hung around the Ukrainian Defence Ministry, even though he's remained relatively popular. And I think what Zelensky's done is by appointing a Crimean Tatar as the next defence minister, it'll actually, go some way towards placating those who were really angry with the defence ministry amongst the ethnic minorities that make up the Ukrainian population.
Oh, just finally, and one more on the Russian side of things. So this possible visit of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is interesting. Now Russia needs North Korea in particular on the weapons side of things, but others are talking about the sort of Cold War imputations here.
Yeah, that's right. And even the suggestion that Russian, Chinese, and North Korean naval ships might exercise together. I mean, I think that's probably not so interesting in terms of North Korean sort of combat power, but it's much more about the optics and that sort of coming out of the cold for Pyongyang, at least in the eyes of the Russians and potentially the Chinese as well. And this would be a very bad thing if it happens. It demonstrates, I think, that Russia is prepared to go to any lengths, including rehabilitating a rogue state, which, it's put sanctions on along with the rest of the UN Security Council over its nuclear weapons program. And the worry is that the North Koreans kind of have the whip hand here because the Russians are so desperate for artillery ammunition. And so what would start as a kind of transaction could then progress to the transfer of Russian high-end technology that could be used in the North Korean missile as well as submarine and nuclear programs as well. And that would be really, really risky.
Yeah, no sort of moral compunction you would think from Russia. So yeah, that is troubling. Matthew Sussex, always good to get your thoughts. Thank you.